The Battle of Thermopylae is one of the most famous battles in Greek history. It occurred in 480 BC during the Greco-Persian Wars. At that time, the Persian Empire was attempting to conquer Greece. The Greeks formed an alliance to try and resist the invasion. The Persian army, led by King Xerxes I, marched through the narrow pass at Thermopylae, where they were met by a small force of Greeks led by King Leonidas. This king represented Sparta. Leonidas and his army, which was primarily made up of 300 Spartans, held off the Persian forces for 3 days, inflicting heavy losses on the Persian army. However, on the third day, a Greek traitor named Ephialtes showed the Persians a secret path around the Greek position, which allowed the Persian army to flank the Greeks and surround them. Leonidas and his men fought bravely, but they were ultimately overwhelmed and killed. The Spartan sacrifice, though, inspired other Greeks to continue their resistance, and they ultimately defeated the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. This came to symbolize the ultimate David versus Goliath victory. Cut to the modern day, today's Russia-Ukraine war is also turning into a David versus Goliath battle. One is a former KGB agent and a ruthless autocrat who's been in power for more than 2 decades. The other is a successful comedian turned politician who found himself thrust into a war after less than 3 years as president. Russian strongman Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky are the faces of this year-long war in Ukraine. It is Europe's bloodiest conflict since World War II. Both Putin and Zelensky were born in the USSR, 25 years apart. They have now become the flag bearers of diametrically opposed visions of a post-Soviet world. For Putin, the Soviet collapse was a disaster that he is determined to correct. But Zelensky has aligned his country's future with the West. He's taking on a much mightier Russian army. On Crux Decode, how have the perceptions of these two protagonists of this war changed in the last 1 year since this war began? Have their images changed? And in the overall context of this war, what may the positioning of these two leaders mean for the outcomes of this war and its wider ramifications? The gulf between Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Zelensky was unmistakable at their first face-to-face meeting. This happened in 2019 in Paris at a multilateral EU summit. Alongside them were French President Emmanuel Macron and the then German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Zelensky, smiling sheepishly and enjoying the international limelight, at one point of time happily obeys cues from Putin. Putin is seemingly gesturing to him to turn and smile for the cameras. Putin, on the other hand, has a rather exasperated expression on his face, showing his impatience with his much younger counterpart. Both then and now, it was obvious that these two were fundamentally different types of leaders. One is modern, young, informal, and the other is closed, archaic, and authoritarian. Since the Kremlin ordered Russian troops to topple the Ukrainian government a year ago, both these men have defied expectations set out for them. Zelensky not only remained in Kiev all through the initial bombings in the opening hours of the invasion, but he has made numerous trips to the front lines, whether it is Bakhmut, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, some of the epicenters of this year-long war. Putin treated Zelensky like a clown, like a comedian, a buffoon of sorts. The invasion that Putin started was the result of his underestimation, his arrogance, and his outright disrespect for Zelensky. All of that, of course, changed after Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It has displaced millions, it has left tens of thousands dead. Putin's place in politics has changed as well. Putin, who had cultivated a hardline image with photographs in the Siberian wilderness, he has failed so far in his military objectives in Ukraine. He's also shirked at the front lines. He's become an international pariah right now. Zelensky, on the other hand, has received a steady flow of top European diplomats. Putin is excluded on the international arena, while Zelensky is welcomed as a guest of honor in Washington and London and Paris. And unlike in 2019, Zelensky has now refused negotiations with Russia as long as Putin is in power. He said, and I quote, "Who is he now? After the full-scale invasion, for me, he is a nobody," unquote. That's what Zelensky told in an interview to British media earlier this year. But the feeling in Moscow that the Kremlin would be unable to negotiate with Zelensky, it goes back to before the outbreak of fighting last February. Putin does not see Zelensky as the type of politician with whom he's ready to talk or negotiate. To him, Zelensky is an alien, someone who is incompatible with his idea of a greater Russian motherland. 1 year into the conflict, Zelensky has galvanized an international cohort of eager donors, both of military and financial aid, and the Russian gains on the battlefield are excruciatingly slow and exceedingly costly. Both men appear determined to keep fighting. Zelensky is facing down the threat of war fatigue at home as well as abroad, and the Kremlin is forced to fight to the very end. Putin is becoming even more intransigent and aggressive. He is sinking into his conspiracy theories, and he's ready to extend this war without any regard to his exhausting resources or his failing reputation. What is propelling this all-in approach is Putin's fear that the same momentum for change which propelled Zelensky to power in Ukraine could begin to turn heads in Russia. His thinking, his calculation is this, that if a clown, a comedian were able to win an election and tells how he's going to change the country, if this happened in Ukraine, then why cannot it happen in Russia? Both Putin and Zelensky may or may not survive this war, but one thing is clear. Both their legacies are being shaped by this war in ways that are not entirely in their control. For the both of them, this is going to be how history remembers them and their legacy. And as we know from previous historical examples, it is always the victor who gets to write history. And that is what is at stake in this war exactly a year after it started.